Hello and welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Marantz Cohen, speaking to you from my office as Dean of the Pennoni Honors College at Drexel University in Philadelphia. This episode is the production of a group of students from the Pennoni Honors College. My guest today is the neuroscientist, Dr. James Giordano. Dr. Giordano spoke to a Drexel Honors class when they visited Washington, D.C. One of the students in that class was so inspired that he asked Dr. Giordano to come to Drexel and sit for this interview. We're so pleased that he accepted the invitation. Dr. Giordano is professor and chief of the Neuroethics Studies program at Georgetown University. He served as a senior science advisory fellow for the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Pentagon and is currently a senior research fellow of the European Union Human Brain Project. His work studying the potential social implications of neurotechnology has been widely influential in academic and government circles. Dr. Giordano, welcome to the Drexel interview.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Well, as I mentioned in the introduction, you head the Neuroethics Studies program at Georgetown. And the field of neuroethics strikes me as somewhat futuristic. And I wonder if you would define it for us in layman's terms and tell us what you do.
Absolutely. Well, it is a bit of a futuristic field in that its vision looks forward. And it anticipates a future of brain science and neurotechnology and being able to not only map the brain, that is to assess the brain, its structure and function, but also to utilize those assessments in a way that we can then access and affect the brain. Clearly, that's what contemporary brain science is aiming to do. These are long-standing philosophical questions that the brain sciences seek to at least develop some nascent answers for. But of course, like with so many things, other areas of science and technology, as this moves forward, very often in leaps and bounds, as the brain sciences have, this then instantiates ever more pertinent questions about what is the good here? I mean, how can we use brain science in those ways that are going to instantiate broad goods for individuals, for communities? And as soon as you start talking about the good, then obviously you're talking about ethics. So neuroethics refers to those ethical issues that are generated in and from studies and applications of the brain sciences in medicine, in public life, and even in things like political areas and security, intelligence, and the military. But also one of the things that neuroscience is dealing with is how do we actually study neurological mechanisms of morality, moral cognition, moral action, and of course, the way we perceive ethics. So this field, neuroethics, has a second area, which is the neuroscience of the way we do morality and the way we do ethics. And so you can't have one without the other. I can't focus the brain sciences on looking at the ways we do morality without studying the brain sciences and how they're doing their good as well.
Okay, well, this is a massive area and very complicated and very exciting. And I want to start by asking you about your own background as it may have shaped this particular focus. You grew up during a period of turmoil, the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, and so forth, feminist movement. And I wonder if those sorts of, I would say, moral issues that surrounded those big events had a bearing on the fact that you wanted to bring science to bear on this moral, ethical terrain.
Well, that's such an interesting question. I think it's one that rattles my personal cage as well as my professional cage. Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right. And giving my age away, I grew up during the early and middle part of the 1960s. And these large movements, these social movements, were certainly important, and they were predominant. We saw them on TV. We were part of the fabric of what I grew up with. But I think more than that, there was a spirit of exploration. I mean, you have to remember we were coming out of the 1950s where certain barriers of our environment were then being forged and broken. And this was the area of the space race. This was big science at its finest. Now, of course, there was an undercurrent there of competition on a global scale, but this too, I think, was very important because the idea of cooperativity and competition, as well as all of these large social movements, were very important in trying to establish not only science and technology as leading forces in human endeavor, but also how these things could be cooperative and or competitive, and what these things then mean for these large-scale social agenda. So yes, absolutely, I think it was very important for me.
So you talk about competitiveness on the one hand and compassion or the moral aspect on the other. And I guess I see those combining in good leadership skills. And that's something you have been concerned with through neurotechnology. How do you feel that neuroethics, neurotechnology can help creating the kinds of leaders, or could have an effect on leadership skills in the 21st century?
Well, here we're really getting to that second dimension of neuroethics that we had spoken about, which is looking at the neuroscience of the way individuals engage moral thought and moral action. And I think when we look to leadership ever more, what we try to ensure is that leadership is conducted in a morally sound and ethically propitious way. But I think the question becomes more of really how can we understand the brain, and in understanding the brain, understand human interactions on a variety of levels. And neuroscience really looks at that from the level of the cellular all the way to the level of the social. So I think by harnessing the brain and cognitive sciences together in this really convergent way, what we can begin to do is get a better understanding of the way humans interact, those who lead and those who follow. And increasingly, we're turning to the neuro and cognitive sciences to utilize methods of modifying our behavior, our cognitions, our interactions with others, to create more dynamic and perhaps more ethically sound patterns, programs, and even training of leaders.
It does assume that someone's in a position of knowing what's morally sound and what the direction of what a good leader should look like. And again, we're back, it seems to me, rather a difficult question. And that's where some of the muddiness comes into play here. How do you feel you can sort out, I mean, if you're really going to be involved in altering people's brains to make them better people, better leaders, better citizens, how do you determine that?
Oh, that's such a pregnant question, such a good one, and I think it's one of the key questions of neuroethics. One of the things the field of neuroethics has done is focus very strongly on this idea of what is the good? What is the good of brain science? And what we've determined is that context really matters. So what is the context of the leader? Who are they leading? What are the dimensions and what are the different concepts that they have to advance? What are the levels of these interactions, and how do brains, in fact, do these things? But one of the misnomers, I think, is that we look to the brain sciences in a reductive way, and that's not necessarily correct. The brain sciences work very, very well as a science of relationality. A brain is a relational organ. No one in the brain sciences is really daft enough to think that a brain functions independently of the body in which it is nested, and of course that body is then deeply nested and invested in an environment. So understanding those brain to body and body to ecologies interactions are important not only for the brain sciences themselves, but when you then put the brain sciences to work, and certainly when you're trying to understand what the good is, writ large, and what the good is of the way you may be able to harness the brain sciences and its technologies to affect human thought and behavior.
So can you give us an example?
Absolutely. We can go from the simple to the little more sublime. I think the simple is an individual who may be taking a drug. And we can say that a particular drug may work to alter the way they cognitively process information. Sometimes these are called nootropics or cognitive enhancers, but I think that there's a bit of a misnomer there. So I'm taking a drug, and for some reason it changes the way I'm able to cognitively process information. I can do it perhaps a little more quickly, or I could do it a little more facilely, and as a result, I change my behaviors with others. I learn more quickly, I'm able to be a little more dynamic on my feet, and perhaps even a little bit more perceptive to others' emotions and their behaviors. So as a consequence, what I'm able to do is interact a little bit differently within key environments. But if I just take that individual and I literally put them in an environment without necessary training or contextualization, they may falter. And this is actually something of an anecdote of individuals who've taken certain types of cognitive enhancing drugs like Ritalin or Adderall. Oh yeah, it may improve certain aspects of their vigilance or their concentration, but without the necessary training and focus, this is an individual who's going to spend all night rearranging the colors in their sock drawer.
Yeah. Well, I know that you were a consultant on this movie with Bradley Cooper, Limitless, which does explore this notion of enhanced cognitive ability. It's a fascinating movie and scary in a way. And I wonder what you think about its feasibility, number one. And number two, in that movie, he's the only one with this ability. What if we all, I mean, that seems to me the sequel that could follow from it is that everybody's taking this drug. And then what happens to, as we discussed earlier, that becomes the new normal.
Correct.
And our whole society then changes as a result of that.
Absolutely. Well, a bit of a caveat here.
Yeah.
I was one of dozens of advisors to this film, and my role was very, very small. But I really have to give great credit. More and more, many of these science fiction films are turning to sciences and scientists to be able to provide advice on script so that there is indeed that kernel of reality. And we've spoken about this in some of our own writing. This is called idola. It's an antiquarian Greek term, and it means preserve the essence. So if we preserve the essence of the science and then extrapolate that a little bit of creative license, that's certainly what we've seen. A lot of the better sci-fi movies, Limitless, I think, being one of them. So a bit of kudos to the screenwriters who did that without my help at all, but they did a great job. But the drug itself was actually based upon an extant drug, which is called piracetam. A fairly old drug. It was developed during the late 1960s and early 1970s, and it was essentially to be used as a cognitive enhancer for people who had dementia. Didn't work real well on them. However, in the control patients, it seemed to actually increase their capability of learning, cognitive focus, etc. So these types of drugs that are generically called racetams have become relatively popular. Now, they haven't really entered the mainstream with regard.
Is this like Ritalin?
No, it's quite different. It has a different mechanism than Ritalin does. It's not a stimulant drug per se. It changes other neurochemical systems in the brain, and in so doing, really appears to increase certain aspects of cognitive focus, vigilance, capability. Does it improve the ability to learn? Well, I think if we take it to the limit, it might. But this is the whole point behind Limitless. If we could go one step further, fictionally, and create a drug that literally improves all the network functions of the brain in both a spatial and temporal way, well, you would have someone who could learn very, very quickly, retain much better, function in a variety of social situations and academic situations, occupational situations, as did the Bradley Cooper character. The question then becomes, well, what's really steering? Is it the scientific push? And you remember from the film that one of the key themes was this was not a drug that was well tested. It was an undercurrent in the movie. The issue there is, well, how much do we need to know? It wasn't just a question of the main effect of the drug, but the drug had some side effects. Were they dose dependent? Were they individually dependent? But the other issue is, do people care? And this is where we get to the idea of not just the scientific push, but also the market pull. Once we let these things loose in the social milieu, then these things become something with higher and higher demand. And with higher and higher demand, you get increased diffusion of some of the rigor of the way they're used. We're seeing this now. What constitutes a treatment? What constitutes an enablement? What constitutes an enhancement? And your final point is quite real. If, in fact, these enhancements then become far more generic, then this defines the new normal. And what do we then do when the whole Gaussian curve shifts? Now we seek something else.
Yeah, we continue to
Correct.
push. But I do think now, looking at it from the other direction, how this might help people with dementia or people with cognitive deficits. Do you see that as a more imminent positive coming out of neurotechnology?
Well, I think that's the goal. I mean, if we really were to look at this specifically, we would see that the core impetus behind much of the investment and articulation of neuroscientific and neurotechnological research is benevolent, literally wanting to do good, benevolence. The question then becomes if we can translate benevolence into beneficence, which is actually doing the good, and what does that good constitute? So many of these treatments that are scientific with regard to the pharmacologies and the technologies such as non-invasive and invasive brain stimulation, even some of the more cutting edge, real bleeding cutting edge things like neuroprostheses, are aimed towards executing the good in those individuals who may be suffering either the ravages of the human predicament of trauma or illness, neurodegenerative disorder, perhaps even congenital disorder, age-related decline, and of course, parts of the human condition as well that have rendered certain individuals less capable, either as a consequence of their own finitude and aging or perhaps by virtue of circumstance. So I think there's a strong push to use these things in good ways, but you know as well as I do, what may be good for me may not necessarily be good for you. And moreover, who's going to get the goodies? Even if we define that all of these things are universally accepted as good, which I think is dubious, who gets them? How do we distribute them? Who can afford them? And this then creates inequalities and asymmetries, and this is an ethical issue.
Yes, it seems like there's so many ethical issues. I mean, I thought when I first was reading your paper about, because you were dealing with the idea of using some of this technology to reduce hostility and aggressiveness in certain, perhaps in a criminal population, could be another. I thought of Clockwork Orange, the late 60s, 70s film, in which the hooligan in it is conditioned to be more benign, and it is both, it seems it's the big brother type implication. And it seems scary, even though it creates a much safer and more pliant society. And I wonder about whether you've thought about those ethical implications. Yes, for the good, but is the good necessarily going to be what we want our society to be?
Well, I think you have to view the Burgessian vision in something of a spectrum. On the one side, once again, we'll default to benevolence. We're looking to do good. What is the good? Well, we have these individuals who, for whatever reason, have a pattern of brain activity or brain development that renders them incapable of either being responsible for the consequences of their behavior, or this is real directed malevolence on their part, correct? So what can we do? Well, perhaps we could incarcerate, we could punish. There are forms of different aspects of the judgment system and legal system. Retributive justice, I think, is one of the things that bangs the drum very, very strongly here. But what about if we were to change retributive justice to rehabilitative justice? This is the Burgessian vision now moving into the idea of medicalizing those patients who may be seen as legal threats or risks to society. Can we and should we do this? Well, I think that even in our own society here in the United States, there's been quite a stigma that's been attached to the idea of psychosurgery that has been legally or state dictated. So we've moved away from some of those large prescriptions where the idea has been top down and it coming down. However, I think that we then get the issue of consent. Is this coercive consent? Is this not? Should we do this to whom? And what do we do with these individuals once we then, quote, rehabilitate them? Certainly there's still the issue of guilt. Yes, they're still guilty, but would this also then perhaps do away with the prison system? And what types of crimes do we then direct these interventions for? Are these equally experimental? Can we extract data from these individuals? So the ethical issues don't go away, they just change in their context and focus.
We'll need a whole new bureaucracy to deal with this.
Very much so.
Brave new world that might come into being or is coming into being as we speak.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And this is actually an area of neuroscience that's referred to as neurolaw, the use of the brain sciences and neurocognitive sciences in various aspects of the law, both to define capability and culpability, and then also to be leveraged in some ways either at determinations of guilt and or at sentencing, and then of course the use of the interventional neurosciences and technologies to be able to affect behaviors, either of those individuals who show a disposition towards violence, aggression, etc., and or those individuals who've already committed such crimes. Very provocative.
Very, very. I am particularly interested, and I know you are because you're the editor of a journal that deals with philosophy, ethics, humanities, and medicine. The way the humanities and, literature or fiction and so forth feeds into science and vice versa. And I'm thinking about the fact, we mentioned Limitless, Westworld now, which is a very popular show. I find it fascinating. The idea of at what point can robots develop consciousness? All of this seems to me to be percolating in the literary world. And to what extent is that being driven by what's going on in science? And to what extent do you think that these ideas in literature, which have been around for a while, are inspiring what's going on in science and medicine?
It's a wonderful question. I think what you're really suggesting here is the reciprocity of art and science, of life and art, if you will. And I think there is a very strong reciprocal relationship that has existed, at least in part because we know that science is directed at trying to address, if not answer, these long-standing philosophical questions that are rich within the human endeavor. What is the meaning of mind? How much brain do we need? What kind of brain do we need for mind? What is the self? Is there free will, etc.? What is manipulable? What is not? Is there some inviolability of the brain space? Is the ultimate privacy, etc.? This is rich. But I think one of the ways that we can explore this is also by utilizing various forms of fiction and media, and done in an ethically sound way, to be able to preserve the essence of what the science is, and then communicate that in an iconographic way to be able to then telegraph, demonstrate, perhaps in some ways predict what the social responses are, both on an individual and group level. This is what the antiquarian Greeks referred to as idola, which is preserve the essence and represent it in a theatrical way so as to demonstrate this could happen. But do so in a way that preserves the reality of it and yet allows both a lens to the science and a mirror upon society with regard to their reaction. I think there's a real challenge and great opportunity here.
Yeah, it's in a way a way to practice or to think about these philosophical questions by bodying them forth in representational forms. So we can look at a show like Westworld and think, well, this could be the future. What can we do to make that work? And what can we do to keep it from getting out of control or being unethical.
I agree.
I don't know whether we can actually come to a consensus about that. That's the problem in our society right now.
But I think you've raised a good point. If we can utilize the arts, if we can utilize the humanities in such a way for them to be a scientific and technological gymnasium, so to speak, to exercise these ideas, exercise both our benevolences as well as our demons, I think that becomes very important for us to do. And if done correctly, the ethics of that, together with the science, can be used to inform regulation and policy by virtue of exemplar. And again, I think that there's a real responsibility that goes along with that. And of course, the neuroethics community is interfacing with the exchange that exists between the sciences and the arts to help broker just this kind of thing. It's actually very exciting.
That is exciting because they have traditionally been apart, and I think here's a great opportunity for the arts and sciences to come together, the soft and the hard, so to speak, and to respect each other more. You have worked, you've advised the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon, which sounds very important.
Like any other form of science and technology, characteristically, the political leader has the most toys, has the most power. So, over the past 10 years, there's been an increasing interest in the brain sciences to be able to leverage just that power on 3 fronts. First is the economic front. This is a huge economic juggernaut that can be leveraged worldwide to create global markets of things like medical tourism, for example, and the idea that certain countries will then be able to penetrate the neuroscientific and technological market space. China, for example. Again, no malevolence here, just simply the idea of economic imbalancing, asymmetries, and power leveraging on the world stage. The second is using these things within military agenda, perhaps to enhance the capability of the combat warfighter or the intelligence operator. And the third, perhaps a bit more nefarious, is the idea of the weaponization of brain sciences, which is not new. The recent use, for example, of VX as an assassin's agent represents the fact that there are still something of an arsenal, albeit covert, of neuroweapons that run the gamut from things like gases and drugs all the way up to organic neurotoxins and increasingly devices and technologies. So the power of the brain, the power to access and affect the brain, is certainly not lost with regard to its leverageability for national security, intelligence, and defense agenda. And this has really, really kept pace with the advances in the field. The more potent the scientific and technologies are, the more potent their capability to be used for a variety of different things. And in this case, military agenda is notwithstanding.
Wow. Are you still involved with this work? I mean, do you know what's going on right now under the present regime, so to speak?
Well, I guess a larger question is, does anybody know what's going on right under the present regime? If nothing else, simply because of the nascence of the regime. And I think that trying to assemble various cabinets and trying to assemble what the Washington infrastructure looks like, particularly on the national security, intelligence, defense side, is still a work in progress.
Okay.
So I can't really speak to that. However, I think if we look to things like what's happening on the world stage, for example, there is an increased interest and address of what was formerly referred to as dual-use brain sciences. In other words, those things that are developed for what appears to be explicitly medical purposes that then either spill out of the medical silo or are actually usurped from the medical silo into political, security, intelligence, and military agendas and initiatives. And more, this is becoming something that is directed and explicit. So we see that since 2014, for example, there's been a real directed interest not only in the United States, but among the United States' Western allies, and increasingly worldwide, in the possibility of the brain sciences being leveraged for dual use, that is, political, security, intelligence, and military agenda. And it's one of the things I'm working on with my colleagues at the European Union Human Brain Project.
So that's the European Union and not the United States. What are they doing that differs from what you saw the Pentagon?
Parse that out a little bit more broadly. I think that the real difference isn't necessarily between what the European Union's Human Brain Project is doing and the Pentagon's efforts, or perhaps other aspects of the U.S. military are doing, but far more broadly with regard to an ongoing project that was conducted here in the United States that is now just terminating, called Brain Research Through Advancing Innovative Neurotechnologies. That's an acronym, BRAIN, the BRAIN Initiative. And the BRAIN Initiative poured about $1.5 billion over a 4-year period of time into neuroscience and neurotechnology, explicitly towards developing cutting-edge neurotechnologies to be able to assess and address neuropathological states, cure a host, or at least try to mitigate a host of neurodegenerative and neuropsychiatric disorders, and also in many ways improve human flourishing and the quality of life. a very, very translational effort here in the United States, the BRAIN Initiative. It's now coming to a close by virtue of the actual 4-year period of its agenda under the Obama administration. It was due to terminate in 2017. But the research continues on because grants were given every year. The European Union Human Brain Project, on the other hand, began as a very basic science project to essentially address, uncover, unravel, explore the structures and functions of the human brain from the level of the cellular all the way to the systemic, and then extrapolate that to the social scale. And also to perhaps to reverse engineer the brain in computational models through neural network modeling, et cetera, to be able to get a much better picture of what it is that brains do. However, over the past couple of years within the European Union, a number of scientists have in fact complained that that effort was too basic science and not translational or applied enough. So what you're beginning to see is a greater alignment with the European Union Brain Project with these larger scale translational agenda. And of course, as soon as you move into the translational realm, where you're taking basic science and bringing it to the bedside, you also have to consider what that means to bring it to the boardroom, and in some cases, to the battlefield. So the European Union Brain Project is equally interested on the potential weaponization and misuse of the brain sciences for nefarious agenda or simply for political, security, intelligence, and military uses.
Well, that's fascinating. We're going to keep an eye on that, and you,
Sure.
and what you're doing
Thank you.
over there. We're out of time, and I want to thank you because this has been fascinating. I think we could go on quite a bit longer and discuss the implications of your work.
That's very kind. Thank you
So,
very much. It was a pleasure.
thank you for being here
Thank
at
you.
the
It's been an
Drexel
honor.
Interview.
It was an honor.
And thank you for joining us today at the Drexel Interview.